So as I mentioned, usually you want to set up a scene. If I'm starting a scene from scratch, I will just put a ballpark human figure scale in my scene. So Maya and like many 3D softwares, it's meant to render things on the real world kind of human scale. So things that are a foot in size or bigger, or things that are 6 feet tall roughly and bigger, render well and animate well and are simulated fairly well and realistically. If you were to build a whole movie just based on like ants or insects, you would actually want to build your smallest insect as like a 6-foot long ant because it'll light better. So everything's kind of tied into a bit of a real world scale. And so sometimes you have to exaggerate the scale for something really, really small, bigger. And Maya in particular is actually very good at handling 3D models and sets that are like the equivalent of kilometers wide and long and big. One of the reasons it's used in film, right? Because we can put these huge, massive sets in. For the purpose of this exercise, though, we're going to kind of take like a small chunk of environment, whether it's like 2 corners of a room or the exterior kind of corner of a building, and sort of focus on that from a sort of a set point of view, right? Where we dress the front sort of visible sides of the set and not worry about anything else. However, as I said, usually when I start a new scene, so I think when I started this, I did have a little box that I set up as a human scale. And when you're in Maya, by the way, if you go into Create and scroll down, there's something called the Measure tool. So if you ever want to find out the scale or size of something, use the Distance tool. And by the way, inside of Maya, there's shortcuts where you can snap to grid, snap to curves, or snap to points or vertices. And the shortcut for that is X for grid, C for curve, V for vertex. So if I hold V, left click on here, you don't see a helper yet, and maybe I'll left click over here. You see it actually puts in a little measuring tool. So it's telling me this thing is 1,000 units across. The default units in Maya are centimeters. So that means it's 1,000 centimeters across for my little ground section that I made, or basically the equivalent of, what is that? 10 meters, right? And I think the height of this building, if I were to measure, let's say holding Alt V, click on this, Alt click on that. I don't know if it made it, but let's try again. Alt. Oops. I think I have to go back to Create actually. Alt, Distance. So then Alt and then left click. Oh, what is it doing? Try that one more time. For some reason my shortcuts are being a little weird, but oh, yeah. I was holding Alt instead of V, that's why. I'm like mixing my Maya and Zbrush here. Okay, there we go. So left click there once, left click again there, and it sort of gives you a rough kind of measurement, right? So not quite accurate there, but 120 units. So it's actually pretty short. It's like a, if you divide that by 30, that is 4 feet roughly in height. So maybe my scale's a bit off. But when you start a scene and when you want to block something out, I do recommend, even if you're building like a highway and like somebody had an overpass from a highway that was like broken and fallen down, very apocalyptic, you don't have to put all the detailed guardrails and stuff in right away. You want to just sort of build things with simple boxes, cylinders, maybe toruses and other basic geometry with minimal editing or maybe no editing, just to get a sense of the space and then decide, can I see this thing from the point of view that I'm going to be looking at it from? So we want to optimize our scene and not necessarily waste too much time modeling things that may not be used, right? If we go to polygon modeling, though, whenever I set up a scene, I generally like to have a real-world sort of full adult, male or female scale reference. So for this, I'll click and create a cube. And I'll go to the channel box and go into the cube inputs. And again, remember, this is in centimeters. So a human that's 6 feet tall is 180 centimeters. And for width, I'll make it about 2 feet or 60 centimeters wide. So that's 60 wide, 180 high, and I'll say about 20 for depth. And if I zoom out, that's roughly our human reference, okay, human scale reference. Something else I like to do is put the pivot to the bottom of the mesh. So you could do this if you go maybe to a front view, right? Zoom out. You can hit D, drop the pivot down, kind of eyeball it if you want. I've got a little tool. So I've got this set up under custom. There's a little tool I have under my custom shelf called Facer. It's got a ton of little mesh tools and tricks and tweaks. It's a free script. So if you Google Facer, okay, Facer for Maya. It's a Maya script. It's a free one, easy to install. It's on a site called High End 3D. So highly, highly recommend it. It actually has a really great sort of thing built into it. So if we go back in here under Mel scripts, it's something called the Pivot Toolbox right here. So when you open that, it actually will do base pivot. So it literally drops to the dead center of the mesh at the very bottom of the mesh. Okay, and then we'll do, base pivot. One of the reasons I like this is whenever you build a character mesh, it's almost always recommended that your character mesh have its pivot at the very bottom and the very center of it for rigging purposes. And we often like to put it at the center of the world. So I usually always like to have my idea of where the center of the world is when I build a scene. And so there's a couple of extra tweaks for this. I want to, if you take a look on the right side, right, the translation, it looks like it hasn't moved off of the world, but technically it is in a different location in the world. So to make Maya recognize this, you have to go to Modify, Freeze Transforms, and then go to Modify Bake Pivot. Actually, I think in that case I only needed to do Bake Pivot. So you see it's actually minus 90 in the world, right? So if I set that to 0, it's now basically resting at the ground plane, or the 0 on that axis. So that's generally how I like to start my scene, and then I would make a big square plane, start to build my reference building, and go from there. In my case here, Zbrush and Maya handle scale very differently, and Zbrush is, like in many situations, super weird about scale. So if you take a look, right, this object is really, really big. If I max out my brush size, I can't do anything with it. It's tiny, right? So what I want to bring your attention to is, like, if we go into geometry, go down to size, this basically tells you the scale of the overall object on its XYZ, right? So left to right, top to bottom, front to back. This thing is huge. It's 100 units. It basically is actually, it's not even able to show anything beyond 100 units, so it sort of like scales it down to that proportion. But if you open up any of the pre-built spheres, right? The sphere is 2 centimeters big. The cylinder by default, 2 centimeters big. The cube, 2 centimeters big. Maya likes a scale of 2 centimeters. I don't know why, it just does. So if you go back to something like this object, right, I would actually take the XYZ slider. So it's a convenient number. It basically looks at the largest number, which in this case is the height or the Y-axis, and you can set it down to 2. That's actually one way I will work with scale, right? Now, there are some times in production where you're technically, the director says, hey, you're not allowed to scale this up or down. You're not allowed to make it bigger or smaller. So in this case, I just want to show you for your own reference, under Preferences, Draw, you have a max draw size, so you can actually increase this to 5,000. So now when I hit S on my keyboard and bring up the draw size, it can now get at least a little bit bigger, right? And there's also something called dynamic. So if you notice on the ZBrush draw size slider, if you hit S, it's on there too. There's a tiny little switch called dynamic. So if you turn that on, it's actually meant to be like a multiplier for the brush size in these situations. And right now the max scale is 1, but we can set this up to like 50 if we want. So now if we take a look, you can see my brush size can actually get quite a bit bigger. I still have a problem with this, and I'll explain why in a second. So I still think it's better to kind of get your objects into ZBrush and scale them down to ZBrush's preferred scale. And there's one very important reason for that, is that when you Dynamesh. Dynamesh is sort of fixed to ZBrush's own internal scale system. And it expects your objects to be 2 centimeters tall or wide, or you know what I mean? So, and I want to show you why. Dynamesh, so let me just go back into our classic sphere. And I should probably reset my brush settings here. So I think max size is 1,000 and dynamic is 1. Okay. So before Dynamesh became a thing in ZBrush, if we go into geometry, let me just make sure it's a polymesh so I can actually edit it. there was a system called Shadowbox. You guys see this? I think I may have shown you guys this briefly yesterday. Shadowbox, what it was intended to do, and you see, look, there's a resolution slider, just like Dynamesh, right? So if I click Shadowbox, it literally converts this mesh into essentially 3 silhouettes, and then it's showing you the result of those 3 silhouettes. So what's really cool about that is that if you control, alt, click, and drag and carve out parts of the silhouette on one direction and then on another, you get this really cool, right, sort of silhouette. And then if I turn Shadowbox off, well, what does it look like? It kind of looks like a Dynamesh, right? It's literally taking the 3 planes and the silhouette and using that grid to project it through, and wherever they cross, they fill or create a volume, and it gives you a mesh that looks like a Dynamesh. And guess what? If I lower the resolution to 16, well, each polygon will only be 16 edges across, the vertical and horizontal. So that was the old school system that we had, right? So let me go back to the regular sphere. So now what we have is Dynamesh. It's basically doing the same thing as Shadowbox, right? Its resolution of 128, it looks like this. So it's a little bit better than Shadowbox. It doesn't make weird flat edges and stuff. But you can sort of see, right? It's got this grid behind. So that's kind of the background mechanism, or the first mechanism of this tool. Well, let me show you what happens with this. And this is about scale, right? So this object is Zbrush's classic 2 centimeters big. If you go into Shadowbox again, I want to show you this. Let's say I'm going to up the resolution to 64, okay? But watch what happens if I scale the object down. Okay? Shadowbox. The resolution of that thing is, it looks like it's going to be, oops. Sorry, let me just turn off the Shadowbox. The resolution is 578. So the resolution slider, right, still 64. But let's say I undo the scale. I still leave the slider at 64. So it's 568 or something like that, right? Leave it at 2 centimeters and Shadowbox. It's 20,000, right? Now, look what happens when you scale this thing beyond, oops, sorry. Scale the sphere beyond that. Well, the Shadowbox is still the same size, so it's going to look like a cube, and its resolution is going to be even a bit higher at 23,000 points. So the point I'm making is that if you leave an object at its original Maya scale at 100 units or whatever the size is, and you Dynamesh it, you'll have to set the Dynamesh slider really, really low to get it to be low res. And even then, it may not Dynamesh to a low enough resolution. So this thing, which is like 100 units tall, right? If I Dynamesh this at a very low resolution, like 8, Dynamesh of 8, on a normal sphere, it'd make it look really, really low poly and really chunky. In this case, I'm hitting Dynamesh. I may wait all day and still have it crash because it's going to try to make it probably tens of millions of polys. Well, in this case, it's not so bad. But look, at the lowest possible resolution of Dynamesh, it's 1.96 million polys. So dense that you can't see it from a distance, right? And that's because, unfortunately, Dynamesh is not relative to the size of the object. It's basically that same Shadowbox tool hidden somewhere, cutting through the mesh from 6 sides, right? Cutting that mesh in. Does that make sense? To fix that, what I would do is literally set this back down to Zbrush's preferred 2 units. And then if you go into Dynamesh, let's say, again, at resolution 8 and Dynamesh, there you go. And now you can sort of better handle and control this mesh and say, you know, I want like 100,000 polys, so roughly a slider of like 200, 300 resolution is going to be good. Now, what happens in the case of a full set, I'm going to show you just one of my scenes that I have kind of mostly blocked out. I'll take this whole set. I'm going to hit Go Z, which is going to send it over. Woo. Bright and colorful, right? Yeah, so the question is, why does it have to be human scale? The reason is that when you go to rig it later on, when you go to light it and render it, the lighting actually has physics, and the physics is based on real world scale, human scale. when you do physics, I'm going to show you guys actually a bit later how to do physics simulation where we break an object and then make the pieces fall to the ground and sit on top of each other in a realistic way. It's a simulation that requires real world scale, human scale. So that's why it's a good reference point. One of the reasons I like setting up my thing in Maya, my project with very basic mesh in Maya, is that it's my reference point. I bring it to ZBrush. I may scale it down. Whenever I send the final mesh back, if I do, then I have that reference point to scale it back up and say, okay, it's got to match basically this scale. So it's basically like a template, right? Anyways, this is a bug that you're seeing. I notice sometimes when you go Z a big scene with a bunch of objects or groups maybe, it can sometimes just crash. This kind of works out better in a way too. So let's say I just send the building. This should launch. And I will show you a really great, amazing trick to get your objects back into ZBrush with one click on the right scale or the right size. So yeah, we'll just let this thing load. Yeah, I find sometimes when you send tons and tons of mesh over from Maya, at least in 2018, ZBrush 2018.5 Maya, it does a weird thing where it can just stall out or crash, even though the mesh is very simple. So when I go Z something like this over, right? If you go to geometry, it's massive. It's just like maxing out the resolution slider. So I would just set it down. So what I like to do as a cheat, or if I have, you can see I kind of have like two subtools in this scene. What I would do is if I sent them over from GoZ, if it worked properly, I would actually merge under subtool palette, merge down all my separate tools and scale them as if they were one big project. So I'd go down into geometry, into size, and just set it to like 2. Okay, so that's now roughly center of the world. And when you have stuff like this sort of collapsed, you can also go to transform and just try to center your pivot or set the pivot to the middle of all this stuff. Although generally I don't like messing with pivots too much. If you want your pivot to be more in the middle of your mesh, you can go to local symmetry. But anyways, the main point is that I went to geometry and set the scale to 2, and then you can re-split things back here. So you can go to split to similar parts if you want, say okay. So you know it's going to split off the columns now, split the roof off, split the stairs off and stuff like that. So now everything's in the right scale for ZBrush for dynameshing, okay? Another kind of weird workaround that I discovered is if you start with a basic object, let's say we just select the whole mesh. This might be actually easier than GoZ for big environments and stuff, is to go to File, File, Export, Selection. And I'll just do this on the D drive, I guess. I'll just go to Set. And then if you go into Import OBJ, right? Import instead of Load Tool. Go to my D drive and find my set. Okay, so there's my set. It's basically coming in as one tool. And guess what? If we go to geometry, size, it's good. It's 2 units. It actually literally replaced the sphere with my new OBJ. And so it's a good scale for ZBrush. And then I would do the same thing. I would go to Subtool and I could say split to similar parts. Say okay. And usually ZBrush is kind of smart enough. Split to similar parts. Is it working? Or maybe I'll just do split to parts for now. Yeah, I'll do split to parts, I guess. And so now like each chunk of debris is separated. Okay. If you ever want to recombine stuff, you can just move them in the order and collapse them. But so now everything should be a good scale for ZBrush, right? My draw size works the way it should. If I go in and Dynamesh this thing, let's go Dynamesh, right? If I up the resolution a bit, up it a little bit more. You know, I should get enough resolution to get me where I need to go. I will say if the set is big enough, you may want to make that scale a bit bigger, like 5 to 10 centimeters in ZBrush kind of units. But for your projects, I would say kind of keep the set a decent size, keep it contained. A final note between kind of working back and forth. Usually I just want to kind of click and go Z and letting things take care of itself, or I just start in ZBrush and bring it into Maya after. But if you are trying to go back and forth, what can sometimes be useful, so let's say you go Z this kind of basic template into ZBrush, right? Super huge. and you say, you know, I'm going to bring it down to that sort of ZBrush scale. So you go to size, just set it to 2. So remember, this is my human reference. It's 160 centimeters tall, but in ZBrush, it's now 2 centimeters, right? So if I try to go Z this back, it will make it super tiny, right? From that to that. So how do we avoid doing that? Well, there's a simple trick. You take whatever you think the size is that you want in Maya. So remember, I want this to be 180 centimeters, right? And right now it's 2 centimeters. You take 180, divide by 2, and that's 90, right? You go all the way down to this tiny little bottom, very bottom menu, export. Set it to 90. So why does that matter? Well, I brought this thing down into ZBrush's preferred scale of 2 units. So now when I export, oops, sorry, not export, but go Z, it comes back the correct size. It doesn't bring it back as a tiny little object, right? So remember, you can kind of figure out what is the size of your object in ZBrush, what is your desired size back in Maya, and you just simply have to do a little bit of math. So if your desired scale is like 30 centimeters, well, I would take that 2-inch or 2 centimeter measurement and divide that, right? 30 divided by 2, you get 15. So that's your scale factor on the export setting, okay? Now, remember, if it was set to the default of 1, and we go Z this thing, then you're going to get a tiny, tiny, tiny little version of that. So, yeah, there it is. Teeny little guy, right? So that's just something to be aware of if you're doing the Go Z import export. I often, like I said, I'll just bring in the set as kind of one big selected mesh. And for whatever reason, when you Go Z a bunch of stuff from Maya to ZBrush in 2018 Maya and 2018 ZBrush, it gets a little screwy. So the safest bet, just load a sphere, a cube in ZBrush, export your stuff as one single OBJ from Maya, and import. And then, like I said, we're not going to be exporting this project back to Maya, so we won't necessarily worry about the export scale.